So again, good morning. I'm Mrs. Randall. For those of you who don't know who I am very excited to welcome you all to our second Wednesday presentation of our 2021 Arrupe series. Welcome back. If you joined us for last week's presentation, we definitely have something great in store this week as well. We're going to begin as we begin all good things, and that is with prayer. So let's begin in the name of the Father, of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Today's prayer is a prayer for light, written by Adrian Porter, S.J., a Jesuit that is dedicated to serving in the fields of primary and secondary education. Lord, let me be still and at peace, just for a few moments, in the busyness of my day. Let me be attentive to where I have been and where I am headed. And let me see where you have been present in my life today. Amen. St. Ignatius of Loyola, St. Peter. So once again, welcome to our 2021 Arrupe series. The Arrupe series is usually a week-long summit on faith and justice, but this year, our 24th year, it will span the entire month of March. The event is named for Pedro Arrupe, S.J., the 28th Superior General of the Jesuits, who charged the Jesuits with their modern mission of forming men and women for and with others. This year's series focuses on public health. The COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted economic, social, medical, and educational inequalities in the United States and across the world. Those on the margins of society have been pushed even further from the center. The racial and economic disparities in COVID-related deaths is a clear indication of this inequality. As a Catholic school, we will examine how our faith understands public health as a universal right and ways in which people of goodwill are responding to the pandemic. Each Wednesday of this month, we will host another guest speaker to help us break open and examine this topic. Today, we are very happy and I am extremely excited to welcome Mr. Joshua Utter to PrEP. Mr. Utter is the outreach coordinator of Jesuit Refugee Service USA. He assists with the JRS's effort to grow and mobilize a diverse and active constituency dedicated to defending the rights of refugees and displaced persons, and to advocate on behalf of US policies that support refugee needs. That's a lot of great work. Today, he is going to help us understand the Jesuit Refugee Service's commitment to accompanying refugees during the COVID-19 pandemic and the creative ways JRS continues its programming. So please give your full, undivided attention and utmost respect to Mr. Utter. Thank you, and Mr. Utter, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. And it's great to be with all of you here at St. Peter's PrEP today. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. But again, I think the name of this summit, Arrupe, is very fitting for my presentation in the sense that Pedro Arrupe was our founder. He founded Jesuit Refugee Service in 1980, and I'll go more into that later. But it's really my pleasure to be here today and to speak on behalf of Jesuit Refugee Service. I'm just one person of a team of committed, individuals, communities across the globe. We're present in 56 countries as of today. And so it's really my privilege and pleasure to be here to just share some of our stories, to share about our work, but also really help you understand how we are walking with refugees during a global pandemic. So again, I think it's really important to understand some terms before we go forward. And one thing to know is who are refugees? And refugees, they're people that have been forced to leave their home, often due to reasons of violence, persecution, conflict. Something is pushing them from their home that does not allow them to feel safe, that puts them in great fear and forces them to go along their way. And many refugees, they have to make that decision to leave in a matter of seconds to escape danger. And this is just a little bit of a thought exercise or a little bit of a reflection. Of course, no one can answer me right now, but I just ask you to think about this throughout this presentation. Is if you were forced to leave home right now, what would be that one thing you would take? What would be that one thing? Often the people that I've encountered in this work, the people who have been forced to leave their home, refugees, displaced persons, they'll tell me, like, it was a matter of seconds that I had to leave, a matter of minutes that I had to leave. And I really had nothing. And I had to leave my country, my home, I had to leave everything. And that's just really the gravity of this situation for so many refugees and displaced persons, that their decision to leave wasn't an easy one. And it's something that continues to define their experience to their present life. But again, who are refugees? Sometimes we have an image that might be not fully realized, but it's really simple. Refugees are people like you and me. They're children, they're adults, they're senior citizens, they're babies, they're anyone and everyone who's been forced to leave their home. So the real simple definition, like I said before, is a refugee is a person seeking safety after being forced to flee violence, persecution, or war. That's a real simple way. But Jesuit Refugee Service, the definition we use, we call it de facto refugees. So in our service, who we're going to serve is anyone and everyone who has left their home for any reason, whatever that fear was that pushed them away, we're going to serve them. And that's de facto refugees, really anyone who has left their home for any reason. But to get really technical and get into some of the legal conversation, we follow, or the global community, the international community, follows this definition from the 1951 Geneva Convention. And so World War II was quite a world-altering event in the sense that people were displaced across Europe, across the globe, and it really forced the international community to respond. They had to respond in some way to serve these people who were no longer in their home region or their home country. And so that's after the war in 1951, the international community gathered and decided this is the definition of a refugee, and these are people that we need to protect. Under international law, these are people that we need to protect. And they said a refugee is someone who is unable or unwilling to return to their country of origin owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. So again, I want to highlight that phrase, well-founded fear. Something really forced them to go, and that really set them on this track to seek safety in another country or in another part of their own country. But again, refugees are people like you and me. They go to school, they go to work. They have their own lives, their own stories that are so important to tell. And often we have images that refugees, that they are completely helpless or that they're so lost in this journey. But that's where we step in, Jesuit Refugee Service, where we really strive to accompany them and walk with them in their journey. And that's something that we recognize in them, is that they are people just like us who have talents, who have gifts. They might be in a time of need, but they're not helpless, and they have hope. They have resiliency. They have something that they're working towards. They have their own goals, their own dreams, and that's something that we really want to help them realize in our work. And so again, I think that's really important to recognize, refugees are people just like you and me. However, today, it's been quite a change from World War II. So World War II, around 11 million people were displaced after that war. Today, over 79.5 million, almost 80 million people are displaced from their home. This quote from Filippo Grande, who is the High Commissioner for Refugees at the United Nations. He says, we're witnessing a changed reality, and that forced displacement nowadays is not only vastly more widespread, but is simply no longer a short-term and temporary phenomenon. So around the time of World War II and in the recovery after, they hoped this situation of, the displaced person would be resolved quite quickly, find some refuge for a time, but then they'll be able to return home. And some have, but many haven't. And what we're seeing today is that this time of displacement is becoming longer and longer. The average time of displacement is 17 years. I'm assuming many of you are around 16, 17 years old. Imagine living your whole life displaced. And it's no longer just a short-term thing again, and it's not temporary. Some of these crises have been protracted. So a country like Somalia, since the early 90s, people have been having to leave there, or there have been refugees who haven't been able to return home. Think of Syria, think of Afghanistan, these situations where people left and there's no sign of ever being able to return home at this point. So again, 80 million people are forcibly displaced worldwide. And I know I was talking about refugees in the beginning, and this is when I'm going to get pretty technical. So if you don't follow along, that's okay. But these are just some helpful terms to understand forced displacement. So today, 80 million people are forcibly displaced worldwide, and that's what we would call de facto refugees in the work of JRS. That 80 million people, we're going to serve them. But then when we're going to get really technical, there's 26 million that are refugees. So these are people who have left their home country and crossed a border into another country, and they've been granted protection. So they're living in a refugee camp, or they are resettled to a country like the United States or Canada or Australia. So they've left their home country, crossed a border, went into another country, and have been granted protection. Then 45.7 million people are internally displaced people. These are people who have left one region in their country and have crossed into another. So they might be displaced within Syria, or they might be displaced within Afghanistan, or the Democratic Republic of Congo, or Colombia. So those are just some examples of people who've been forced to move within their own country. And they haven't crossed an international border, and they have no protection. Technically, they're still protected by the country they live in. However, we know that sometimes this displacement is due to ethnic or racial or religious reasons, and they still might feel threatened within their own country. Then 4.2 million are asylum seekers. So that means these are people who have left their country and they're at the port of entry or the border of another country. So think of people who have crossed Central America to reach the southern border of the US. There are asylum seekers who are attempting to receive protection in the US. And once an asylum seeker receives protection, then they are technically a refugee. They've received refugee status. They're protected by international or the law of that country that they're seeking protection in. And then 3.6 million people are Venezuelans who have been displaced abroad. And this is an interesting group. It's not typically included in this number of displaced people that comes from the United Nations. So Venezuelans, it's been a crisis since 2015, when over 5 billion people have left Venezuela, and many of them, they don't have, their process wasn't regular in the sense that they might have crossed at an irregular border point. So they don't have a legal definition at this point, but again, we're still serving them. And we serve many Venezuelans in Colombia and in Ecuador. So again, these are just numbers to help you realize the gravity of this situation, of global forced displacement. When I'm speaking about refugees, so thinking of this group of just of this 80 million, again, using this like de facto term, I know it gets confusing, but of this 80 million, 68% of them come from just 5 countries. And you can see here, some of those countries include Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan. So that's quite significant, that refugees are mostly coming from just 5 countries. But then where are they going? And again, this is something in the United States that we tend to think that, oh, the United States, we take on the burden, which isn't a great phrase, that we take on the responsibility of welcoming refugees, that we take in, it's too much, it's going to burden the United States, but that's not true. The reality is that mostly the developing world welcomes most of the refugees. And you can see here the top 5 countries that host refugees: Turkey, Colombia, Pakistan, Uganda. You don't see United States up there. You don't see the United Kingdom. You don't see Canada. Countries that are known for being wealthy and might have the resources to really help make sure that refugees are able to find safety and refuge within their own borders. And again, if you're curious, all these numbers come from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and they release these numbers every year on World Refugee Day. Some other important numbers to know, just to help us understand the global crisis, and this also can help give context for what things look like during COVID. So 60% of refugees live in urban areas. Many people think that refugees, they're only in camps in these remote rural areas, but many refugees are in urban areas. So in Johannesburg, in Bangkok, those are just some examples. In Bogota, many refugees are in these urban areas where they can almost become invisible, because in a camp, there are resources that are directed towards the refugees that all live in that area. When they're in an urban area, it can be a little bit more difficult to find those resources. And again, I already said before, the average length of displacement is 10 to 20 years, but I think it's really around 17 years that we see. And then another thing to know is that less than 1% of refugees resettle to a country like the US. So resettlement is when a refugee leaves their home country, crosses the border into another country. So the example I'll use is a Syrian who crosses into Turkey and then is seeking resettlement to a country like the United States or to Sweden or to the United Kingdom. But only 1% of refugees really experience that. And the United States, we are known for our refugee resettlement program. There was a time when we were resettling over 100,000. Under the Trump administration, that number started to decrease significantly and really set the tone globally in the sense of how are people welcoming refugees. So it went from 80,000 refugees 1 year during the Trump administration, all the way down to only 15,000. That was a significant drop. Now with President Biden and his administration, he wants to raise that number to 125,000. But again, some would say that's still not enough, that there's still many refugees out there in need of this protection. And then some other important numbers to know is that 40% of all displaced people are children. So this is really affecting the youth, and more than half of all refugee children are not in school. So, here in the US, we're really experiencing this time that's really unsettling, in the sense that children aren't in school, their education might not be the same as what it was before. But for refugee children, this is their daily lives, as they're on the go, as they're in refugee camps, as they're in urban areas, there are many gaps in their education. And refugee children are 5 times more likely to be out of school than non-refugee children. So 63% have access to primary school. So think of like K through 5. 24 have access to secondary school. So again, just imagine if you didn't have the opportunity to go to high school. You're working towards college, but only 24% of refugee children have access to secondary school. And then only 3% go on to higher ed, to university, to college. This is significant because, here in the US, we base so much of our livelihoods on our education, but this isn't always something that's a given for refugees. And that's something that JRS, we're really committed working towards, that we really want to make sure that refugees have access to education. And again, you can just see that. So Jesuit Refugee Service, we see all those numbers, these current numbers, and we do our best to respond. So in 1980, when we were founded by Pedro Arrupe, it was in response to what was happening in Vietnam. Thousands of people were leaving on boats. This image really shocked people. They couldn't believe that people were risking their lives to get on these boats and packed full as they were seeking refuge. And Father Pedro Arrupe, he said, hey, Jesuits, we got to do something. We got to respond in some way. And so that's when he started Jesuit Refugee Service. And we've grown significantly, outside of Southeast Asia to now 56 countries. And these are some of the regions, but we're almost present on every continent and really committed to walking with refugees in their journey. And again, you've seen some of this, but last year we served over 800,000 refugees. So we're smaller compared to some other organizations that serve millions and millions of refugees, but our work is really committed to this work in education. So here you can see some of our different program areas. Number one, I would say, it's at the bottom, is education. We run a number of schools for refugee children, from camps to urban areas, but it's not only education for children. We provide schooling for adults who are needing to learn the local language, or we provide pre-K for the younger kids. So if their parents are out working, that they have a safe place to go. But some of our work also includes, psychosocial support and mental health care. So we provide counseling, we do home visits, we do things that really help accompany people as they're dealing with the trauma of having to leave their home country. We also do some livelihoods programming, which is another word for helping people, learn business skills, become entrepreneurs, start their own small business. That's a lot of our work too. So I went to Ecuador in 2019, and I was able to see really how we were helping Venezuelans find ways to start a small business in Ecuador, because it's really tough, or they really have no opportunity to get in the market in Ecuador due to their status as a Venezuelan. And so they have to find creative ways to really enter the market. And so it was really interesting way. So if you've seen the show Shark Tank, I was able to see how JRS programming does a iteration of that to help people get that money so they can start their small business. But we also do legal work, so helping people get a regular status. So again, the example I'm going to draw from is Ecuador, helping Venezuelans get the proper legal status so they can start receiving protection from Ecuador, rather than crossing into Ecuador without having that recognition of their status. And then we do some emergency assistance. So COVID-19 is a great example. This time of a pandemic, really responding to the needs, the health needs of refugees. But then also another recent example was the Beirut explosion. When that huge explosion happened in Lebanon, we were there to make sure that refugee families were protected, because parts of Beirut that were really devastated by the blast were areas that many Syrian refugees live in. So we were there to make sure that they received some of that emergency assistance right away, but then also providing that support and counseling after such a traumatic event. So again, for JRS, it's really about accompanying people. And I think this quote from a man named Stani, who's in Dzaleka refugee camp in Malawi, he really, I think, just gets to the heart of things in our work, is when he says, "I've learned that life is more than being a refugee, relying on food rations and waiting for resettlement. It is more about learning for life through every opportunity granted." And he has a very optimistic view, and that's great. And that's something that we at JRS, that we really strive to help refugees recognize. And again, that they are more than just refugees. While we know they are refugees and we recognize their experience and what is going on, we also see them as people who deserve hope, people that deserve to receive healing. And that's something that we really strive to do in our work. And it's less about us like, here we are helping you, we feel great. It's more about, what can we learn from you? How can we accompany you on this journey? And how can we help you reach your full potential? And that's really what it's about. So with all of that in mind, we get to this time of COVID-19 in a pandemic. And so JRS, we've really had to pivot, so a lot of our work is in education, as I said. And what does that mean, for children who don't have access to laptops because they live in a refugee camp, and that isn't an item that's, commonly held by families. And how can we provide psychosocial support? How can we provide counseling when people don't always have, again, access to Zoom or technology to have these conversations virtually? And so we've really had to be creative. But to start off, of course, right away when all of this started, we really turned our operations in many countries across the globe to really be focused on delivering PPE and helping people understand the situation and the context. And so here, though, I'm going to present some of our key issues that I think that JRS really saw during this time and continues to see. So number one was access to PPE and sanitation. So refugees, they're in urban areas and they're in camps. And even though camps are in rural areas, it's really crowded. Living can be really crowded. So how do you socially distance during this time when you all live in this cramped area, you're all trying to receive the same resources, the same goods? Crowded living, both in urban areas too, and many of them did not have access to the PPE that we really recognize. Like here in the US, wear a mask, wash your hands. And those are things that we, take for granted. So we really work to make sure that people had those resources. Then again, there's education, this issue of education. How do we run schools when we don't have the resources, the technological resources that we take again for granted in the US? And so we had to be really creative in the ways that we reached out to students. So one way was WhatsApp. So using that app for teachers to provide tutoring or some basic lessons to a large group. So basically just a group chat with their students, making sure that they had access to some of the lessons of the day. In other areas, so like the Central African Republic, all of our education programming was happening over the radio. So children would listen to the radio as a way to learn their lessons. And also in Zuleika refugee camp, that was common. But then another big issue that we've been talking about during this time is access to the vaccine. Now in the US, everyone is lining up, trying to get their chance to receive that vaccine. But what does that mean for the global community, especially refugees? And that's something that JRS that we're really calling to mind in our work to advocate for refugees. That we call for equity in vaccine distribution, because again, refugees, they're all ages. Many can be adults that are over 65, and so really they're in a vulnerable situation, and they should have a right to the vaccine just as we do in the US. So this is a statement from our executive director, but vaccine equity, especially for refugees, will not only accelerate the end of the spread of the disease, but is a central issue of justice to which we must respond. So again, that's something that we're really working towards, making sure that this is something that is just and fair and that the vaccine is just distributed equitably. So going forward, so these are just going to be some images of how we've been responding from, PPE. So this is Afghanistan, where some of our teachers at the schools were going around visiting families, just dropping these materials off so people could learn all about COVID-19. And also those bags, that green bag that this teacher has, it has all the basic PPE stuff, hand sanitizer, face masks, all of that. This is from Zuleika refugee camp, using their phone over WhatsApp to learn some of the lessons of the day. And then here's the radio. Students were using their radio to just keep up with what was going on in school. This is in Chad. So we were still, again, really having to pivot. So some of our programming is teacher training. So making sure that teachers had the proper certification to keep teaching, at the schools. And so we still had to find ways to make sure that they could still receive that training. And because again, not many have access to technology in the same way that we do. This was here, just getting ready for one of those certification classes. And then home visits. So again, the one thing is that although refugees, they live in these crowded camps, there is still access to many open air spaces. So we are still able to do some of the home visits for our counselors to go and speak with our clients to help them during this time. And then again, just making sure that people are set up with proper sanitation. So making sure there are hand washing stations in these different areas. And so just going back to that, I think for us in the United States too, so I work for the US office, and just a little bit about our work here. We really work so our main office is in DC, and our work is really focused on making sure that these programs are supported worldwide, but a lot of our work is also in advocacy. So working with the government, talking with senators, talking with representatives, working with different committees to make sure that these issues that are facing refugees worldwide are gaining attention, that we're still able to support these people, because the US government does do a lot of work of supporting refugees worldwide. So making sure that the funding's still there, making sure that these services continue to be provided, but then also recognizing what's going on here within our own country, and especially at the southern border. And so during this time of COVID-19, many people were still seeking asylum. They're still coming to the US southern border. I will say that the number dropped significantly during this time, where fewer and fewer people were able to reach the border due to restrictions on travel, across Central America. People weren't flying on airplanes as much anymore. But still, we at JRS, those people who are still reaching the border and putting in that asylum claim, they shouldn't be forced to wait in Mexico. There are policies called Remain in Mexico that were forcing them to wait there, which weren't really looking out for their safety. These policies, here in the US, we thought, the Trump administration thought that this program was going to really make sure that it was safe for people in the United States, and using COVID-19 as a way to say that, hey, these people shouldn't even be coming in our country due to the public health crisis. But at JRS, we really believe that, if someone's that afraid to leave their home, if they're really seeking that protection, they should be able to receive that protection no matter what is going on. And it can still be done in a safe way. Schools were still opening, people were still able to go about their daily life in a safe way, following the public health protocols, making sure that we were wearing masks, using sanitation, things like that. And so that was something that was really important for JRS during this time in our advocacy work, was making sure that just because it's a pandemic doesn't mean that a person's right to protection and to asylum should be taken away. And so that's something that we're really paying attention to. And it's an area that we're growing into. So we're currently in the process of starting a program at El Paso Ciudad Juarez. So in Texas and Mexico, starting a program to address, again, these mental health and psychosocial needs of refugees during this time, because it's been really difficult. And many people are in Mexico really struggling during this time, because they're separated from their families. They're not able to cross into the US to find that protection that they're really seeking. So there's this uncertainty, this concern for their safety, that someone could still get them in Mexico. And so that's something that we're really going to work towards, and also providing some legal support during this time. But that's just to help you understand what our work looks like in the US. But again, I think as I wrap up, so that we can have some time for questions, I think it's really important to hear this quote from a refugee. He said this: "When I lived in a refugee camp, I never imagined that one day I would live a better life. In the camp, death became normal. Funerals were like birthday parties. Mourning was a way of comforting oneself, and suffering became a way of life. But I was grateful for the suffering, because at least I was not dead yet." So I know this quote, it's not the most, it's sad, it's hard to face, but this is, I think, something that even in the US that we're experiencing today during this pandemic, is that we're having to deal with this suffering, and how are we going to grow from it? And I share this quote because it was something that was really important to him, that he wanted to make sure that his story was told. That he says, "I've been living through this difficult life, and I lived in a refugee camp, and I felt hopeless in a way. I was being cared for, I was getting food, I was getting water, I had my basic needs met, but I really felt like there was something that was missing, and that was me being able to achieve my full potential, to be able to give a life, or live a life, really just was able to express my talents, able to chase my dreams." And he eventually left the refugee camp. He was resettled to another country. But for him, that time in the refugee camp, he was saying it was a time where I learned so much about suffering, but it gave me hope because I knew that my life was worth living and worth giving what I've received back to others. And so his things have really turned around for him, but it's also recognizing that, hey, things can be really tough. We can be in the weeds and unsure and uncertain of how things will turn out. But it was that time that he experienced in the camp with organizations that really saw his potential, that really helped him know that there are things that he can work towards, that really helped him just feel like, again, that this life is worth living. And that's, again, I think key to the work of JRS is that we really accompany refugees on this journey, no matter where they're from. And another thing to know is too, is that while I work for the US office and I represent our work in DC, my colleagues across the globe, many of them come from the refugee community. Many of them are refugees themselves. So they might be a Venezuelan in Ecuador who is working for JRS Ecuador. In Syria, they might have been internally displaced due to the conflict there. So many of my colleagues across the globe, they know this journey, they know this challenge. And so it's just something I think that really speaks to the mission of JRS, is that we are really trying to accompany people, walk with people, and not abandon them on their journey. So at the end of this, you might be wondering what you can do to get involved with JRS. And I think really to start is raising awareness. So you can raise your own awareness. So I think, continue to look up some of these organizations I mentioned. You can go to our website, jrsusa.org, to learn more about our work, or you could go to UNHCR, the United Nations. You could go to their website, learn more about their work and how they're helping refugees. And then that's where there's a lot of great resources on statistics and numbers and stories. But you can also go to our website too. If you're really moved to take action, visit our website at jrsusa.org, take action. There you can learn a lot about the different ways you can get involved with us and maybe also advocate on behalf of refugees. And under that support refugee organizations, I say on April 15th, 2021, we have an advocacy day where we'll be speaking with congressional offices. That's a daily part of, well, not a daily part, but a common part of my work, and also with my colleague, Julia McPherson, who's our director of advocacy. So we're organizing this day for constituents across the US to get involved and speak to their congressional office to make sure that these issues, so talking about COVID-19, talking about asylum, making sure that our representatives in Congress really know that these are the issues that are really affecting refugees and displaced persons. Of course, then we also encourage you to pray with us. So actually on Friday, we're gonna have a Stations of the Cross event with Father James Martin, but there are a lot of great prayer resources on our website too, if you wanna pray with us. But those are just some small ways. You can always reach out to me. I'm always happy to talk and learn more about ways that you can get involved in your own community to really get to know the refugee community of where you might be living. So I know in Jersey City, in the greater New York area, there are many refugees in that area, in your community. So I think really just come to learn more about that community and how you can accompany them. But I'll leave it at this point for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Utter. Wow, is all that I can say immediately. I'm thoroughly impressed just by the sheer creativity used to reach and teach children and adults in all of the different areas around the world. And thank you for doing the work. Thank you for sharing with us this morning. And I am going to turn this over to one of our seniors and one of our leaders on the campus ministry team, Owen Fletcher, and he's going to ask you a few questions. If anyone watching the presentation has any questions, please drop them in the Q&A box and we will be sure to get to as many as possible. And one other quick note, for those of you watching, I will make sure that we have those links and resources available to you all at the end of the presentation that Mr. Utter shared in regards to upcoming events and how we can all get more involved. So thank you. And Owen, I'm handing it over to you.
Thanks, Parental. Mr. Utter, just first off, on behalf of the student body of prep, I really want to thank you. I think that all of us were really filled with a hope for the future and inspiration of what we can do. And you touched a little bit about it, but when there is a COVID outbreak at a refugee shelter, what happens to the refugees there? Does their journey just stop? Does it pause? And you talked about the limited resources. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think, again, it like depends on of course, the center and everything. But I think what we see, of course, if there's an outbreak, we'll, of course, have to shut things down, like how things kind of work here in the United States. But and then for the movement of people, though, yeah, it's a tough situation because they might be journeying towards somewhere else. And some centers, a lot of people are coming and going, but that's when we've seen some of our centers having to limit operations. But the other thing is that numbers have been going down in the movement of people. So we might see more crowded areas like in a city where more people are like stopping, but the movement has definitely changed due to COVID, where fewer and fewer people were coming to borders or coming to centers, but then that's changing as of recently. Numbers are starting to go up, but 2020 saw a significant decrease. But when it comes to outbreaks, yeah, things have to shut down for the time being.
Mm-hmm. And you talked a little bit about the southern border, and with that answer, you talked about how it's all gone down, but do the reasons for migration and the reasons for refugees kind of change a little bit with COVID?
That's a good question. I think, so people are still, in situations at their home where and this is what's, so pressing about this time, is that this restriction on movement doesn't mean that people aren't still experiencing the things that force them to leave their home. So that's what's very concerning about this time, and that's why we especially are like, hey, we can still welcome asylum seekers, that we can still welcome refugees, we can still resettle refugees in our country, because the things that were forcing them to leave haven't stopped. And some countries, it's just things are very different, the way that they've addressed the COVID crisis. And so some people, there's a lot more freedom of movement within the country, and so people are still being displaced within their home country due to conflicts arising. So while COVID may have put things at a standstill here in the US, but then, recognizing what even happened in 2020, there's a lot of movements, a lot of change that happened, and the world doesn't stop even while we're socially distanced.
Perfect. And then just one last thing, is there any healthcare provided to refugees if in the event they do get COVID or a COVID outbreak occurs?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think it depends on the service and the program. JRS, our healthcare isn't our top service. Like, that's not one of our main program areas, but we do provide some of that. So for example, in South Africa, we do have nursing case managers that really help make sure, like, if someone gets sick, if they have COVID, that they're able to get to the hospital, that people are able to transport them if they can't call an ambulance, so it depends on the country. And again, but that's what's so great about our staff, my colleagues globally, is, and depending on the region, that they've really had to pivot again and make sure that if someone is sick, that they have a list of resources to help connect them with in that situation.
Will the JRS then defer or point refugees in the direction of other services and healthcare in that regard?
Yeah, that's a great clarification. Yeah, so just they'll refer people to the right place to go.
All right, perfect. And Ms. Randall, if we have anything in the chat that you'd like to ask.
Yes, thank you. So let's see here. We have one really good question. Obviously, and Mr. Utter, you referenced it as you were talking in regards to how some initiatives have changed from the last administration into the new administration. How do you think that that plays a role, specifically because refugees are unable to vote as United States citizens? How do you think, or can you explain what would be like a large obstacle for the cause here, considering the fact that they're unable to vote? So in a certain sense, their voices aren't heard in the same way. And how do you think that affects like the cause within the US, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. And I think one thing that's why it just gets to the heart of what we really believe in accompaniment. And so here in the US, I think that's really supporting local refugee resettlement agencies or organizations that really work with refugees and immigrants, because they really help make sure that the stories, the issues that are affecting refugees in the US come to public knowledge, that they're able to be shared, and that our government knows about these issues. And because you're right, the aspect of their voices silence a little bit when they don't have the right to vote, but that doesn't mean that they can't keep talking and that they can't keep calling attention to what's going on. And I think that's really dependent upon us to listen, really listen. That's, I think, a great challenge during this time, just to sit and listen and hear a story. And so I think, if anything, that's the most important thing you can do. Be patient, come to know their story and how they got here, because I was blown away. So I worked with some refugee resettlement agencies in the Midwest, and in Minneapolis and in Omaha, Nebraska, and what they've been through and their journey, not many of us can imagine to survive and live to tell the tale, in the sense that so much has been taken away from them. But then I'll never forget one woman. She was a Somali refugee and lived in Minneapolis, and she said, so much has been taken away from me. And she had a speech impediment, and she was getting really frustrated with her job search in the US, because she's like, so many people won't hire me because they just see me as like a helpless case. And she's like, but I have to keep reminding myself that God gave me a voice, God gave me my hands, God gave me my eyes, my mouth, he gave me everything. And I have to keep telling my story no matter what. And as much as people might bring me down, there's still something that I have to give. And that really moved me, just hearing her story and knowing that, like, that's what I really strive to do. And that's why I encourage students like at St. Peter's Prep to really come to know these issues and come to know these stories, and then help advocate on their behalf. Like they can speak to for themselves. I know they can, but I also think it's when there's community and organization, that's really when things can change.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I've already had one student inquire about how to sign up for Walking with Refugees. So it's obvious that many of our students are moved by this, and we all need to use our voices. And we thank you for using your voice to share with us this morning.
Of course.
Yes. I don't have any additional questions. So again, thank you, Mr. Utter, for being with us today and for such a wonderful and informative presentation. We really, really appreciate you taking the time to share your knowledge with us and to answer our questions. I'd also like to thank Ms. Friedlander, as always, for her great work running the webinar. And thank you to Owen for doing a really good job facilitating our Q&A. A very huge thank you to the prep students, faculty, and staff on our Arrupe Planning Committee, who put a lot of hard work to prepare this year's series. Before I let you all go, please check your emails right now. You will see that Mr. Doherty has already emailed you a form with some reflection questions. So please take some time today to fill out the form and let us know what you learned from today's program. Also, for many of you, while today was your assigned talk and you only have to attend this one, please know you are welcome to attend any of our upcoming talks that we'll host this month. The series continues next week with Father George Williams, the chaplain at San Quentin Prison, who will talk about how the pandemic has impacted the prison population. And if you'd like to attend that event or any other speaker, please reach out to me. And seniors, remember, you're invited every week to join us on campus for an Arrupe watch party and reflection. Finally, thank you all for your attention and have a wonderful day. Thank you, Prep.
Thank you, everyone.